guys. Thanks for joining us again this week. So the last time we had an episode, we talked about anorexia and how one of the biggest kind of common denominators between people with anorexia is actually perfectionism. And we wanted to dive into that as its own individual topic. This is something I'm like an anti-perfectionist. I am not very perfectionistic myself, and it wasn't something I was hugely interested in until I became a therapist. It's something I see clinically all the time, and it's actually really interesting. And it's definitely got a dark side. So I think a lot of times we can think of perfectionism as just like, oh, it's people who want to do really great work. Like they just put that extra effort in, go that extra mile, and that can be seen as a good thing. And it can be. But on the other side, there's all sorts of different kinds of perfectionism. There's perfectionism in terms of like how you view yourself. Like either you have to be perfect or you're worthless. There's perfectionism about how you think other people view you, as though if you ever make a social mistake, or you ever kind of let them know something about you that they don't like, then you'll be seen as worthless or rejected, or like there's something wrong with you. So all of these super high standards about how you should be. And there's also perfectionism about how you see other people and how they should be. So having really high standards about their behavior and what might be right or wrong. At its extreme, it can turn into a personality disorder called obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that is not OCD. That's a totally separate conversation, although perfectionism is linked there too. But obsessive compulsive personality disorder is its own thing that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. I hadn't really heard of it much before Duke, actually, but it's pretty prevalent. Kibby?
I'll just say that perfectionism is an interesting concept because when we talk a lot about the different symptoms and problems on this podcast, maybe the downsides are a little bit more obvious, right? Like if you have a substance abuse issue or depression, the downsides are very clear to the person suffering and the people around them. So it's those are things that are more clearly like, oh, I'm going to get help with this, right? It's more clearly a problem. Perfectionism is hard because it's something that's reinforced and rewarded a lot in society, right? So if you're we jokingly say in job interviews, like, what's your worst trait? So perfectionism, right? As a way to like a backhand compliment to yourself. I don't know, like a humble brag. Because that actually is rewarded highly in school, getting good grades and, at work with achievement, and people love employees and students who have the kind of perfectionist tendencies. So it's not as obviously a problem to a lot of people. But when we talk about it here, it actually is related to a lot of disorders. It drives a lot of disorders, anxiety and depression. And what we're really talking about is the rigidity and inflexibility of these high standards. So what I mean by that is, a lot of people can have high standards and be high achieving. But if someone is really unable to kind of disengage from those standards, or they have to achieve those standards no matter what, even if it makes them unhappy, or it makes them go crazy, or makes them, look over their work a million times, that's when it really becomes a problem. And that's when it starts to lead to other forms of psychopathology. And obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is a little bit more about having high standards while you're interacting with other people. So Jacqueline, you could kind of go into OCPD.
So if somebody has OCPD, they have 4 of the following symptoms. So the first is just, maybe you're the kind of person who spends a lot of time focusing on details, order or organization, making lists and schedules, and all this sounds great so far, right? But what if you're doing this to the point where you don't even get the thing done because you're just spending so much time organizing and trying to get everything together and get planned and get perfect, that by the time the deadline reaches, you're just like, oh my God, I haven't actually done the thing.
Right. It's kind of that people who make lists and schedules and have an agenda, but what you could ask yourself, are those helpful? Are those systems helpful? Or for some people, it's actually not helpful. People get lost in the trees and forget the forest, right? They're spend, as you said, spend so much time on those lists and schedules that the point of what you're trying to do gets lost. And that's when it becomes more of that criteria of that disorder than just like, oh, I'm just a good organizer. Right?
Exactly. And something that a little bit related is that maybe you have trouble finishing things because you spend so much time trying to get them exactly right. So, I mean, this is the person who can't finish a painting because they keep just tinkering with the tiny little details, or finishing a paper for class is so hard because they're like, is there a typo anywhere? Like, is there any single grammatical mistake? Have I made this point in the best possible way? And it takes a really long time to get these things actually out the door and completed, because it's like, God, it's just not perfect enough. Another sign is that you're so devoted to your work or to being productive that you rarely get to spend time doing things that you actually enjoy. Or maybe you do things that you enjoy, like you're spending time with friends and family, but you're bringing your work along with you. You're checking your email the whole time. You're taking little breaks to Kibby's smiling because is this you?
Well, when I was learning to assess these criteria, God, our friend Caitlin made fun of me so much because I definitely met criteria for this during grad school. I was on vacation with her. We were at a beach resort. And so the criteria is if you have a hard time even on vacation, not doing something productive or feel super guilty. And she actually caught me I snuck in, I pretended I was going to take a nap, but actually she caught me doing some work and submitting a paper.
That is disgusting.
She made fun of me pretty badly. And so that ever since then, she was like, that criteria, that's you. So.
You lied? You lied so that you could go do work?
I was so ashamed about it because, we had this big talk about how this is going to be a time for just the beach, no work. And I said, I'm just going to take a nap. She's like, oh, go for it. And she caught me on my laptop like, ah. So it's not my proudest moment, but it's for
not
all
something
of you.
I can relate to.
You might do the opposite.
I would do the opposite. I ignore work while I'm at work.
You'd be in the bathtub. Anyway.
Okay, so this is my personal favorite sign of OCPD, which is having very, very high standards about what's right and what's wrong. A lot of people endorse this initially because they're like, oh, I have high moral standards. Like, I think you should treat people well. I think everyone should be equal. Then they're like very they'll stand up for those beliefs. But this is when, you have standards that are so high that you really can't be flexible with them at all. And this could mean that if you have a high standard, like let's say you have a moral belief and you meet somebody who doesn't adhere to it, it's like you think they're a bad person, you can't listen to them, there's just absolutely no wiggle room there. It also might mean that you have really high rules of decorum. So you might have rules about people showing up on time, paying attention to you. You might be the kind of person who's like, I can't go to a dinner party without showing up with a fruit basket and a bottle of wine. And if I don't do this, then I just can't even go to the dinner. And then you might think, well, if I throw a dinner, everybody there must show up with a fruit basket and a bottle of wine. I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but it just shows how people with this disorder can get really, really rigid and get kind of trapped with thinking about how other people should behave as well. It can also mean things like you never speed, you never go above, the speed limit. You would never consider drinking before the age of 21. I'm trying to think of other examples. You would never jaywalk. So, I mean, it can just be these kind of rigid beliefs about following rules to the letter of the law, no matter what. Another one is that you might have trouble throwing things out because they might come in handy someday. So really, really holding on to even useless, worthless possessions, bordering on trash because you're thinking I can't get rid of this because what if someday in the future I'll need it.
And stuff with no sentimental value. Right? So, a lot of people say yes to that, and I ask what, and they go, oh, a T-shirt that my best friend gave me. I was like, that doesn't count. That's sentimental value. So stuff like receipts or napkins, it's kind of like a hoarding behavior, right? So just cluttering up your whole house with things that are worthless.
like plastic utensils from takeout or something like that. It's hard for you to work with other people or delegate unless they agree to do things exactly to the T how you want them to do. Yeah, so this can be really hard if you are an employer, a manager, because suddenly work's piling up on your desk because you're unable to delegate it. It can be really hard if you're working with a team because people might have different ideas about how to do things and you're so stuck being like, no, it has to be done this way. It can be very, very hard for you to spend money on yourself or other people because you're thinking similarly to the behavior around, keeping objects with no sentimental value. It's like, what if I need this someday? Always preparing, always, wanting to control for some future event where you might need it. Difficulty changing plans. Let's say you have a friend coming in town, you have a plan for them, and then it rains. You can't go to the park like you planned. You can't, go sightseeing, and it's a catastrophe. Or, you had a doctor's appointment that day. You planned your day around it. The doctor's appointment gets canceled. Suddenly your whole day is trashed. And lastly, other people saying that you are stubborn and a general belief that you are a stubborn person.
And keep in mind that, with any of the personality disorder traits that we talk about, these are traits that there's a spectrum. And when we're talking about is people listening are probably going to resonate with at least some of these, right?
Totally.
But it's really about if you tend to do this in all areas of your life, at work, at home, all throughout, most of your childhood and your adulthood, right? In all different kind of settings. I have to follow the speed limit, but I also have to follow every rule at work and at home. It has to be a certain kind of cleanliness, otherwise I'm going to freak out, right? So it's a little bit of this pervasive, like you're doing this in all different areas of your life, and in a way that gets in the way of your life, that doesn't really mesh well with, your community that you're in. And this is tricky because, for example, this is, interesting when I'm learning about how to assess these criteria. Asking people from different countries, immigrants who came to study, that question of do you hold on to worthless items that might be useful someday? People from different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, will say, well, yes, of course, because everything is useful. I have to keep everything. I can't waste anything. And that's because they grew up in that kind of culture. But that might be normal. Right, yeah. That might be normal for that kind of culture, whereas we have a culture of throwing things out or throwing out receipts or whatever. So it really depends on if you have this behavior in a way that really gets in the way of you getting along with others, right? If everyone is breaking the speed limit, right, then can you be flexible with that, or do you go at 15 miles per hour, right? So it really depends on how you mesh with others, and I do think that when people talk about, really colloquially, you've heard, oh, I'm so OCD about this, or that person's so OCD. Actually, I think they mean more OCPD, right? Because it's like this controlling, high standards, unrelenting standards behavior, which is different than OCD, which is more like obsessive thoughts and compulsions, which we'll talk about at some other time. But
yeah, so OCPD is kind of the extreme end of perfectionism. But perfectionism in general can affect us in all sorts of ways. And I think one of the ways that both just sort of, and I don't want to say normal levels of perfectionism, but not, but both OCPD and just high levels of perfectionism is that it can lead to a lot of loneliness because you might feel as though it's so hard to open up because what if somebody sees something imperfect about you? So afraid of saying anything that another person might disagree with, of having anybody think less of you. And if you have these beliefs, then it's really hard to get close to people because they're not going to know you authentically. And you might not be able... if you have these kind of beliefs about yourself, like, my worth comes from everybody thinking that I'm perfect, no one can think there's anything wrong with me, then it becomes really, really scary when maybe you believe something or you feel something that doesn't totally align with other people.
You're making an interesting point because we could think about these as the perfectionism or OCPD, whatever you want to call it, as defenses against something, some threat, right? At least the patients that I've seen with perfectionism, these unrelenting standards for themselves or other people, it's either to defend against potential danger. So a lot of patients that I see in OCPD have a trauma background where their household was chaos and they had abusive parent or sibling who would just be dysregulated and cause havoc. And so that my patient would learn order and organization and predictability was super safe. So they get really controlling over their environment, right? So they don't want anything to be not what they planned, because then they would just leave themselves open and vulnerable to unpredictable scariness. Or they think that there's something wrong with them, right? There's a sense of self problem, like I'm defective, I'm not enough, I'm worthless, I'm actually unlovable. But holding high standards, like if I am perfect at work, if I have straight A's, that's going to defend against people seeing my inner defectiveness. So it could be like an identity thing where you're just like, this is where you derive your value. Yeah. So, I mean, just at least just thinking about that in terms of, I know that it could be hard to have a loved one with perfectionism or OCPD, but you could think about that as like, this is their way of feeling safe.
Yeah. So a lot of people who grew up maybe feeling different, maybe had a different cultural background from the norm, might feel like they were never quite able to fit in, they were made fun of, they weren't enough. And so using these other standards of perfectionism as almost like it could make up for their deficit, or at least obscure it.
That does remind me, I did have a patient who came from an Asian country, was homosexual, and was discovering that through therapy, and really worked on perfectionism a lot, because for them, being really perfect at school and work was a way to get acceptance, to get approval, and for people to not notice the internalized shame of her homosexuality. And we could also talk about the downsides of it. I mean, there was a lot of benefits in her life to be a perfect student, but also she spent hours looking over her papers for any typos, looking over every email, being unable to speak in class because she was afraid of saying the wrong thing, obsessing over if she made a mistake in a social gathering, like said the wrong word, like, someone said, "How are you?" and they said, "Have a nice day." She would just think about that over and over and over again. So eventually it took up a lot of mental space, this perfectionism, and to defend against being seen for who she felt like she was, her authentic self.
It's also just, so incredibly sad to have that conflict in you in the first place, to feel like there's something that's just unacceptable about me that I have to make up for all the time. Like I can't relax ever. I can't let people see me because they'll see this thing that isn't even wrong with her to begin with. It's just how she's been treated. That's just such a... Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah. I know, it's that, but, work through it in therapy, and we'll talk about that, but...
I feel, it's like I feel trapped listening to that, and I think that's how perfectionism can make people feel also, just constantly trapped. There's no breathing room for anything. There's no exploration ever, because exploration involves risk, mistakes, another big downside I've seen is like really afraid of trying new things, because when you try new things, you're by definition not good at them. Unless by some miracle. And so that can be very difficult.
And it's hard for the loved ones. It's hard for people who are a partner or friends with someone with perfectionism, because there might be a lot of reassurance seeking, like, yes, it is good. Yes, it's, no, there's no typos. Yes, you said that correctly. No one noticed that mistake. But also they could feel like they're walking on eggshells, and that trapped feeling, right? Like I can't possibly do anything wrong. Otherwise my loved one with perfectionist tendencies might get really upset. Like I can't possibly, I didn't clean up everything perfectly. That person's going to freak out, right? So it could be very, it could create a lot of hypervigilance and a lot of yeah, that feeling of I have to meet those standards myself, otherwise there's going to be problems.
Yeah, especially if, the person with perfectionism is misinterpreting cues or behaviors on your part. I mean, Paul and I got into this to an extent where, he has very rigid expectations about how the house should be kept. He's become much more flexible lately, but in like certain conversations he wouldn't necessarily like. And if I slipped up and didn't clean the house in the right way or whatever, it'd be taken as like a slight against him. And that kind of thing can happen a lot. Like, again, if you think that people come over to your home without a gift, without an offering, or they don't make their bed when like, some of these things can be considered rude, but the person with other-oriented perfectionism can really take it as like, they don't respect me, they don't care about me, they're a bad person. Yeah. And it's no kidding, you feel trapped when you're on the other side of that, because there's no wiggle room for you. There's no oops, I forgot this one time, or oops, I was in a rush, or I just flat out don't understand your expectation and it doesn't come naturally to me, or I meant that statement in a different way than you interpreted it. So just, yeah, that rigidity can become it can infect other people.
Yeah, I've seen that in couples therapy too, where a partner of someone with perfectionism will say, like, I just feel like I never can do enough. I'm never good enough. I try to clean or do things the way he or she wants me to do it, and I keep messing up and keeps causing problems. And then for really extreme perfectionism, it's kind of like chasing a dragon. It's like raising those standards higher and higher, right? It's actually quite functional to be like, here's my standard of, I don't say perfection, but of a satisfaction. And then when I get there, great. And if it's a little off, okay, fine. I don't like it. But people with really intense perfectionism will keep raising the bar. They'll keep being like, no, it's not good enough, even for myself. Not good enough, not good enough. And it's that chase that makes people feel really anxious and depressed, especially with depression, where it's like you're sad, you can never feel good enough for themselves or the loved ones.
Yeah. And I think maybe a final point on this is like, if there is something you're afraid of letting other people know, then that fear might become so expanded because you're not letting it out. You're not finding out that it's actually normal.
Going back to your loneliness thing, a lot of social connection is being vulnerable and open about your inner stuff to other people, or your inner messiness. And so that could just be really hard. Like, you first of all don't connect to others, but also you're just kind of living in your own world of checking if you're perfect or not, right?
Yeah, and your own fear. Like, if there's a part of you that's like, what if there's something wrong with me for believing this, and you're too afraid to confide in other people, you're never going to find out that, like, maybe that thing you're hiding is actually totally normal. Like, I don't know. Like,
it's interesting. I think we're talking about how shame can be a big component of perfectionism, or at least defending against shame, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, Kimmy, tell us about treatment for this. Treatment for perfectionism or treatment for OCPD?
First of all, it's really hard. I actually find it's really difficult. The first step is to really highlight for the patient the downsides of perfectionism, because there's a lot of upsides, but a lot of the downsides, I ask, like, chasing these standards, what are you missing out on? How are you living not in line with your values or living your fullest life? And people might give examples of, I spent hours checking emails, or I spent hours making sure I'm perfect, or all I do is think about whether I have messed up or something like that. So really, some of the downsides might be like creating that kind of space and flexibility in your life, like that freedom from having to meet those standards all the time. Or that, the connection with others, right? So really just highlighting the downsides and also hiding the plus sides, right? Of understanding that, yes, perfectionism, high achieving, high standards can have made you feel safe, has, led to a lot of approval, a lot of good things. But when is it actually impairing you? When is it actually getting in the way of your life? So really getting the motivation is like number one. And then there's all these different ways to actually tackle those standards. So one really concrete way that we've done in cognitive behavioral therapies is, okay, really becoming aware of those thoughts of those standards and making them more realistic standards, right? Because sometimes it's like, as I said, chasing the dragon of like, I got to get better. Mm-hmm. But maybe setting a realistic standard of, okay, what is a report card that you realistically can get to? Okay, what is the number of, I don't know, whatever, money or cleanliness or, actually defining those standards very clearly, with some wiggle room, like, okay, like what is an acceptable range? Mm-hmm. And having that really clear in that person's mind could even just take the anxiety out of it, and it could be communicated more clearly to the partner, right? Mm-hmm. Versus just this vague sense of things are never good enough. So actually getting something that is good enough. But we also do a lot of actually acceptance and commitment therapy. Strategies from that can be really useful. And that's a lot of just acceptance-based and mindfulness-based strategies of like noticing when you have these perfectionist thoughts or standards, noticing when it's taking away from your life, and then really getting comfortable with the discomfort of when things aren't perfect, right? So it's kind of like exposure to imperfection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so exposure is the other piece too, and we can get quite creative with that. I remember when I was in college, I took an art class, watercolors, and I'm really bad at watercolors, and I hated this class and did eventually withdraw. But at one point, I made a painting that it wasn't good, but it was clear that I was trying to like make something pretty and perfect instead of making something creative and fun. And the teacher told me that she was going to give me an F unless I painted something else and I aimed for a C. So that kind of principle can be applied, if you play an instrument and you get really obsessive about that. It's like, no, I want you to play this piece like you're aiming for a C or an F, like make it really, really bad.
Yeah, that's funny because we've used that technique in CBT for perfectionism before, where it's like the homework is to expose yourself to being imperfect, like be imperfect on purpose. Mm-hmm. So in session, it's funny that you bring up the watercolor. I did have a patient who was so perfectionist. She was an artist and she was so perfectionistic about it that she couldn't draw because she was just terrified of just not being her best. So I just gave her a pad and paper, a pen, and I said, draw a cat and make it the like ugliest cat you've ever made. Just make it just horrible. And so she at first was shaking. She was like, she really couldn't. But then over and over, I had her do like 5 of them in a row, the ugliest cat she could possibly make it look like a 5-year-old. And sit with the discomfort. She did not like it, but over the, this is the exposure, right? Over the 5 times she drew it, eventually would laugh about it, and she'd make it even look sillier, and opening up to the imperfection, and also for her seeing that the downsides or the things that she's afraid of didn't happen. Like she thought that I would judge her and think she's a horrible artist, and no, like we just had a great time.
Yeah.
So that was one example.
I just thought of one for myself because I'm not a perfectionist when it comes to writing, but I'm a huge procrastinator, and I think perfectionism comes in there. But like, set a word limit that you have to write, like 1,000 words in 5 minutes. Just make it impossible to do something perfectly. Like set a timer, put limits on it that are just too, like there's no way you can make something perfect, but you have to get something out. And then, with social perfection, maybe it's don't wear makeup tomorrow. Show up at the party without flowers or like a 6-pack or whatever. Like, tell somebody something that you would normally hesitate to say. Ask a question that might sound a little awkward. Play Kendall's question book, just to like, get some weirdness out and unbutton a little bit.
Knowing that it's going to be uncomfortable at first, but it gets easier and easier. It is harder for loved ones, though, because as we said, that perfectionism is a hard thing to let go of. It's a hard thing to tell someone else, like, you are being too perfectionistic, because that person's probably getting a lot of praise at work, right? So it's hard to kind of challenge that. But I think having an honest conversation with your partner or your loved one about the downsides, like that how it feels, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel scared to mess up? Do you feel like you have to reach those standards of perfection? Do you feel like that gets in the way of your relationship and connection? Really highlighting the downsides for that person.
I think it's important also to note, I mean, basically what you're saying, which is the person with a perfectionistic partner can buy into the idea that that other partner is doing things better and that there's something deficient about them. Mm-hmm. Like, if they don't clean the house as well as a perfectionistic partner does, and that partner has high expectations, you might start to think of yourself as slovenly, because of course it's better to have a cleaner house. So these things where it's like, maybe your wife, like, works all the time, even when you're on vacation at the beach, and you're sitting there enjoying yourself, and you're like, what's wrong with me that I don't care enough about work to be doing this? Like, maybe I'm lazy. And so,
for the record, Caitlin did not feel that. She fully made fun of me. She went and enjoyed the beach herself. So, but yeah, so you can see that someone else might feel weird about, me sitting there doing work at a beach resort.
Yeah. So just really kind of reality checking yourself and checking in with friends and being like, is there something wrong with me? Am I like, or is, really getting a realistic take on this relationship or this dynamic? Like, no, it's.
Actually, an example is like my dad had OCPD, traits of it, undiagnosed, but as a therapist, we just like to diagnose the people that we love. And he was so detail oriented. He did that thing where it's like the lists and details would get in the way of the point that he was trying to do, and he would spend hours vacuuming or doing whatever work he was doing and fixating on it to the point where he couldn't shift. He couldn't do something else. So he was chronically late. And that made my stepmom and my mom, both women married to him, furious, right? Like, they were hours late every time because he could not take himself away from whatever details he was working on. So, if you have a loved one like that, like, talking about, like, we are always late because you need to be perfect because of the perfectionism. So that's a real downside that really gets in the way of our relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So really noticing what's going on, trying to not let yourself become shamed or feel lesser than because of these ideas about the positivity of perfectionism in our society or in that partner's mind. And then setting boundaries, our favorite thing to say. I was talking to a follower today who's married to somebody with OCPD, and she, basically her process with him was figuring out what's going on. She said, at first I didn't understand how to handle, his obsessiveness, perfectionism, and definitely viewed it as a threat to my freedom, which, that's maybe that trapped feeling that we were talking about. And that now that she knows that he struggles with this, she's able to offer grace, but then second, place healthy boundaries. So she will say, I understand that you need this a certain way, but I will not allow your desire for perfectionism to control my life. And she says her son has to do this with him as well, because he has very high expectations for his son's for her son's behavior, which I imagine can be a little difficult for her as a mother to see this. And so she and her son both work on setting healthy boundaries with him. Alrighty, so Kibby, resources.
Yeah, a book that was recommended to me to work with patients with perfectionism and OCPD was the ACT Workbook for Perfectionism, Build Your Best and Perfect Life Using Powerful Acceptance and Commitment Therapy and Self-Compassion Skills. So ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, another acronym, is a type of CBT that really uses kind of experiential and mindfulness techniques to help people. It's kind of what we're talking about, kind of be more comfortable and learn how to tolerate the discomfort of imperfection so they can live their fullest life, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this book is great. It's very accessible, and you can read it. You can read it with the person with perfectionism. I think it's one of those like workbooks that gives kind of like the theory and some exercises. So it's a really good one.
Awesome. Well, I hope you all enjoyed and found this helpful, and we will always be grateful for perfect 5-star reviews and comments on this podcast episode or any other. So thank you for that in advance, and we'll see you all next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.